Hello everyone and welcome back to the bench. If you've been watching the channel lately, you'll know that we've been building this 1/48 scale Swiss BF109 E3 from Tamiya, and after some extra detailing with photo etch and 3D printed parts, we're finally ready to paint. Arguably the most intimidating part of the whole build. I should say up front that I'm usually an armour modeller, so expect to see a few mistakes, some learning moments, and possibly a couple of regrets along the way here. I'll also mention that I'm just getting over the tail end of a cold, so if I sound a little strange in this video, that's the reason. It's not some dramatic new narration style. After giving the model a quick once over with some IPA to remove any fingerprints, grime or dust, I sprayed a matte black primer over the entire airframe. This helps unify all the different surfaces and materials, and more importantly, it lets us see what we're actually working with before committing to our colours. I'm going to be doing a late war Swiss scheme on this build, which means a dark green fuselage with some extremely distinctive white and red banding on the wings and on the body. To make those areas a bit more visually interesting in the final result, I thinned down some AK white acrylic and I sprayed it through the airbrush to pre-shade the entire model. Here I'm loosely filling in each panel, deliberately avoiding the panel lines so they stay in the black primer. With the subsequent layers of red, white and green, the hope is that this variation will still subtly show through. Hopefully. That always seems to be the word doing the heavy lifting with my pre-shading. Speaking of those red and white stripes, next up was masking. I grabbed a few different thicknesses of masking tape and carefully marked out the white areas on the wings and on the fuselage. Decals are provided in the kit for the red stripes, but they are Tamiya decals, which are pretty thick. So wherever possible, I decided to mask and spray instead. As someone who mainly builds tanks, where I've found masking generally pretty optional, this was a new and fairly interesting challenge for me. I tried to be extremely careful, making sure the tape lines were parallel, which is much easier said than done over sloping wings and compound curves. This part took longer than expected, involved a lot of stepping back and squinting at the model, but I think the test of patience was pretty pivotal in getting the whole project over the line. I found that I need to thin AK 3rd Gen white much more than my other acrylics to get it to spray nicely, but once I dialed that in, it behaved pretty well. It was soon time to reveal our work. Please enjoy the masking tape peeling compilation. I hope the satisfaction comes across on camera. I suppose this is the payoff for the time investment of sticking all that tape down. Okay, the next step was to repeat the process for the red stripes, once again carefully masking the areas and spraying a thin coat of red over the appropriate sections. I think the red ended up being the most successful colour when it came to the pre-shading on this one. In hindsight, it also would have been much easier to just leave the tail rudder separate during the construction phase. Masking it in place was a bit fiddly, and the whole part just needs to be bright red anyway. That's one of those planning decisions that didn't seem important at the time, but it definitely became obvious later on. Alright, once again, I hope you enjoy the peeling compilation. I mean, just look at those red and white stripes. I was genuinely excited by how these turned out. The flatness and the surface detail that I got from masking and spraying is leagues ahead of what I could have expected from the decals, and I think the extra effort really paid off here. At the risk of this becoming repetitive, the next step was more masking and spraying. This time it was for the light blue underside. I did already have a few mistakes to correct here. The large red fuselage panel shouldn't wrap fully underneath, so I resprayed that area in blue. I also painted the inside surfaces of the flaps in this blue tone based on the references that I found on this subject. That was actually part of the reason that I posed these flaps in the lowered position during construction. I wanted to show off a bit of that underside colour when looking at the model from above. More satisfying tape removal here, and my one regret is that I didn't save the enormous bundle of tape that came off this model, because I can tell you it was immense. The tailwing edges were left white in this curved pattern, which is a really nice little detail, and it adds a lot of character to this scheme. Finally reaching the end of this masking marathon, and it was time for the black-green upper colour. This is a slightly nebulous shade. The Tamiya callout looks nothing like the restored museum example in my reference book, which in turn doesn't quite seem to match period colour photographs or box art from other manufacturers. I just took this as official permission to exercise some creative license, and I mixed up my own dark green and black to land somewhere in the middle of all my references. It did end up fairly dark, but honestly, the colour is literally called black-green, so I think that's acceptable. I kept my coats light here to avoid overpowering the pre-shading, and I do think that restrained helps me to give a more subtly interesting finish overall. At this stage, with the main colours down, I got a little overexcited and I peeled the front canopy masks before remembering that there were still varnish layers to come. So yes, those did have to be remasked. But for the penultimate time in this video, please enjoy some satisfying masking tape peels. And unfortunately, one not so satisfying moment. Some of the white paint lifted on the fuselage hatch, which meant a bit of off-camera cleanup and blending. In hindsight, spraying a varnish layer between colours may have helped here to protect our work so far, but that's a lesson for next time. I also realised a little late that the aircraft code needed a green cutout over the stripes, so I went back and sprayed that in. Well, technically speaking, the green is underneath the stripes rather than over them. The thinner white and red bands were a later wartime addition for recognition, and it seems the ground crews didn't want to bother repainting the codes, so instead masked out a rectangle around them before adding the extra stripes. Alright, main paint work done, and now it was time for the decals. I've decided to use the white crosses provided in the kit, as masking these accurately would have been a challenge I wasn't emotionally prepared for, especially after the time investment and the accident with the peeling that we'd already had. The decal sheet includes 3 sizes, 4 large crosses for the wings, 2 medium ones for the fuselage sides, and 2 very small ones for the rudder. I also tried a little experiment here. So as I've established, Tamiya decals are known for being quite thick, but after watching a Will Pattison video and doing a bit of reading on forums, I learned that hot water can help soften the adhesive on the carrier film and thin them out. For that reason, I filled a kettle and I brought some almost boiling water up to the bench. For this experiment, I figured it made sense to start with the underwing crosses, since they're the least visible once the model is finished. I flipped the plane over, carefully cut out the decal and dropped it into the hot water, before immediately realising that I'd cut out the wrong size. That was one of the fuselage ones. After a brief moment of confusion and a bit of internal panic, I flipped the model back over and I checked the paint guide to work out exactly where this one was supposed to go. After a little while of floating around in the hot water, I slid it into position and gently pressed out the excess moisture and the air bubbles using a cotton bud. I took my time here, especially around the panel lines and the raised details, because this is usually where Tamiya decals will show how thick they are. I then repeated the same process for the upper wing and the other fuselage crosses, using the same hot water method each time. With markings in place, I applied a layer of microsol and left them alone to do their thing. At this stage, they looked fine, but I wasn't entirely convinced yet. This is normally the point where I walk away and prepare myself to be slightly disappointed with the results. And honestly, to my surprise, it worked incredibly well. Once everything had fully dried, the decals had settled down much more than I'm used to seeing from Tamiya, and the carrier film was far less noticeable. I'll put some photos up on screen here to show what I mean a bit more clearly, because this is easily the best result I've ever had using Tamiya decals. I'll definitely be doing this again for them in the future. The identification code on the fuselage side went on next, followed by some of the smaller stencils and icons. By the time I got around to the really tiny decals, the water had cooled down quite a bit, and you can definitely tell. The carrier film on these later ones is much more noticeable compared to the earlier markings. I did still get a bit of silvering too, particularly on these smaller markings, but I think that could probably be improved next time with a gloss coat beforehand or by using microset as well. If you've got any other tips or tricks for getting decals to behave, definitely let me know in the comments, because no matter what I try, they never seem to come out perfectly for me. With the decals finished, I moved onto the undercarriage and painted the wheel wells and landing gear interiors in grey to match the references. I did all of this with a brush because I think we've all had enough masking and spraying for one video. That pretty much wrapped up the main painting, and it was time to move on to weathering, which I deliberately kept fairly restrained. I applied a coat of AK Ultramatte varnish, which unfortunately exaggerated some of the decal silvering, as you can probably see on the black no-step markings on the wings. After removing the canopy masks, I did go back in carefully with a sharp scalpel to trim away excess carrier film and to minimise the appearance of that silvering. Now for the controversial step, an enamel pin wash to bring out the panel lines. If I could rewind time, this is probably something I'd change. On the dark green areas it works really well, but on the white and blue surfaces the contrast feels a bit too strong to my eye. Do you agree? Let me know in the comments below, and if you're enjoying the video so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss any future projects. While that enamel wash dried, I moved on to some detail painting, starting with the exhausts. I wanted a heat damaged metal effect on these parts, so I began with a dark brown metallic base, then lightly sponged on some white acrylic to catch the raised areas and set us up for some interesting tonal variation. This effect comes together very quickly with a pass of raw and burnt umber oils, toning the contrast difference down and tying everything together into an effect that I was really happy with for just 2 simple steps. I dropped these into place with a spot of PVA glue and continued our weathering effects with some chipping. It's pretty common to see heavy wear on the top surface of the wing root from the pilot getting in and out of the plane, so that's what I wanted to replicate. I started with sponge chipping using a lighter green for superficial wear, followed by a more precise silver chipping with a fine brush. Again, I kept this fairly restrained based on reference photos of Swiss aircraft, which generally appear much cleaner than their German counterparts, especially late war examples. I was pretty happy with the level of wear I achieved here, and it's going to be toned down by our next steps anyway, so we don't have to worry. Once our wheels were attached, I gave them a pass of MIG accumulated dust effect to show off some of the moulded details. I then flipped the plane back over and used the same dust effects to replicate dust and earth from the pilot's boots around the wing root. This enamel was thinned significantly with white spirits so that we were left with a subtle final effect. Again, I'm really not trying to make this plane look like it's not being looked after or maintained. Then again, certain effects are pretty much unavoidable when the plane is in active service, such as some exhaust staining, which I added with a mix of dark brown and black oils. This was applied along with subtle gun staining around the nose and the wings. These aircraft flew regular patrols defending neutral Swiss airspace from both the Axis and the Allies, and they definitely saw some use. With the project nearly finished, I fixed the canopy in the open position using the locating tabs, and thankfully this was a very straightforward step. The final challenge was the antenna wire running from the cockpit to the tail. As someone who usually doesn't build aircraft, I didn't have specialised products like EasyLine on hand, so after considering the classics like stretch sprue or fishing wire, I ended up settling on some very thin steel wire from my materials box. This ended up being pretty nightmarish stuff to use, but I do think it looks the part. For the sake of brevity, and because nobody wants to watch me struggle with superglue for the next 10 minutes straight, we'll call the project finished here. I'm really happy with how this turned out, especially for one of my very rare aircraft builds. I'll run the slideshow now, and afterwards I'll explain how I made a quick and simple airfield base just so this model doesn't look lost on my shelf. As always, thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to see more aircraft on the channel, although the next few big projects will definitely be armour. I'm just deciding between a 172 build and a 135th one at the moment. Okay, as promised, I made a very quick and simple base for this plane. If you're watching from the UK or Ireland, you'll probably recognise this Celebrations lid, which happens to be a great size for 1/48 scale aircraft. If you're watching from elsewhere, do these exist where you live? I genuinely have no idea. Anyway, I sprayed it black with a rattle can, as those seem to adhere to this plastic much better than my airbrush acrylic primers. I then filled the recessed area with AK acrylic mud paste to give some natural texture as well as a brown colour which might poke through below our flock. After a layer of Mod Podge, which is like a thin down PVA glue, I sprinkled on a mix of yellow and green flock. I ran out of this mix much faster than I expected, so I topped it up with pure green in places before knocking off the excess. That excess could then be used to fill all the gaps that were still left over, and after one final tap on the bench, that's more than enough to sit our 109 on. Simple, but definitely better than my bare shelving. See you next time.